60 square feet. One shelving unit inside an ordinary backyard greenhouse outside Portland, Oregon. No bigger than a 6x10 stretch of floor space most people would use for a couple of tomato plants. Last month, that single shelf generated $3,200. No outdoor signage, no retail storefront, and nothing visible from the greenhouse door beyond trays of small, strange-looking plants most passers-by wouldn't be able to name. Before we go any further, subscribe and hit the bell. This channel publishes one complete income breakdown every single week, and if you miss one, you miss the specific mechanism that made the numbers real, because nothing on this channel is a lucky one-off. Here is what nobody tells you before we start. This shelf isn't one product. It's 5 distinct product zones, all built around a single plant category almost nobody thinks to monetize, each one targeting a slightly different tier of the same collector market, from a $10 starter plant to a $100 tissue-cultured rarity. Real numbers, one real greenhouse shelf, no projections, no theory. Let's go. The woman behind that shelf, we'll call her Ellie, since she'd rather keep her name off the internet, spent 7 years as a plant pathology lab technician at a state university before a round of departmental budget cuts eliminated her position along with 4 others in the same lab. It wasn't performance. Grant funding for the whole research group had been cut nearly in half, and technician positions were the first line item to go. She had 8 weeks of severance, a mortgage, and a small backyard greenhouse she'd built 2 years earlier purely as a hobby space for propagating houseplants. Her partner worked full-time in logistics, income that covered a real share of the household's fixed costs, but not enough to comfortably absorb Ellie being out of work for long. In the second week, they mapped out exactly how many months they had before harder decisions would need to be made. The number was just under 4 months, and that deadline shaped everything that followed. Ellie describes those first weeks as disorienting in a specific way that a lot of people leaving a narrow academic or research specialty recognize. She'd spent 7 years becoming genuinely skilled in a fairly niche corner of plant pathology, skills that didn't translate cleanly into most job postings outside academia, and the handful of comparable research positions she found were themselves facing the same funding pressures that had eliminated her own role. She applied to over 60 positions in the first month and heard back from 3, none of which led anywhere close to an offer. About 3 weeks into a discouraging job search in an unusually narrow academic specialty, Ellie found herself spending more time than she probably should have on a corner of her greenhouse she'd never taken seriously. A small collection of carnivorous plants, Venus flytraps, and a few sundews that she'd originally bought years earlier mostly out of curiosity from her lab background in plant biology. She'd never propagated them deliberately or sold a single one. But sitting in her greenhouse one afternoon, dividing an overgrown flytrap clump purely to give it more room, she realized she had, without ever intending to, produced 6 new plants from one, essentially for free. That observation is where this actually starts. Carnivorous plants, it turns out, occupy a strange and underexploited niche in the specialty plant world. Genuine collector demand, prices that run considerably higher than an equivalent houseplant of similar size, and a level of care complexity that keeps most casual growers from ever attempting to propagate their own, which means most of the supply comes from a small number of serious growers rather than any kind of mass commercial production. I want to walk through all 5 zones the way Ellie actually built them on that single 60-square-foot shelf, because, as with every breakdown on this channel, each zone targets a different tier of buyer, and together they cover a collector's entire path from first purchase to serious enthusiast. Zone 1. Venus flytrap divisions. Income range $600 to $900 per month. Startup under $80. Time commitment roughly 3 hours a week. A mature Venus flytrap clump naturally produces offshoot divisions as it grows, genetically identical smaller plants attached to the same root system that can be separated and grown independently once they reach a viable size. Ellie's original 6-plant discovery came from exactly this process, done almost by accident. Once she understood the mechanism, she began deliberately encouraging division by repotting her stock plants slightly more often than a casual grower typically would, which stresses the plant just enough to trigger additional offshoot production without harming the parent. Here is the income angle almost every casual carnivorous plant owner misses entirely. A single healthy flytrap sold as a small division runs $12 to $20 retail, which sounds modest next to some of the other zones on this shelf, but the actual production cost per division, once a stock plant is established, is close to nothing beyond a bit of the specific nutrient-poor, moisture-retentive growing medium these plants require. Ellie sells divisions through 2 channels. A specialty houseplant shop that stocks a small carnivorous plant section and takes standing bi-weekly restocks, and direct sales through an online carnivorous plant collector forum with a dedicated marketplace section. Monthly gross on this zone runs $600 to $900, the most consistent and lowest risk of the 5 zones, since Venus flytraps are relatively forgiving compared to some of the rarer species on the rest of this shelf. A grower outside Asheville, North Carolina, running a nearly identical division-based flytrap operation on a similarly small shelf inside a converted sunroom, reports almost the same range, $550 to $850 a month, sold entirely through a regional plant swap community and a small home-based nursery license rather than a collector forum. The specific sales channel differs. The underlying mechanism, patient division of an easy, forgiving species into a steady stream of low-cost-to-produce units, is identical. Biggest mistake: overdividing a single stock plant too aggressively in pursuit of faster output. Splitting a clump before individual divisions have developed a strong enough root system on their own produces weak plants that struggle or die in a buyer's home, which generates refund requests and damages the exact reputation this whole shelf depends on. The fix costs nothing but patience. Let each division establish independent roots fully before separating it from the parent, even if that means a slower production cycle than the numbers on paper might tempt you toward. And here is where it connects to what comes next. Every flytrap division Ellie sells comes with a small bag of the specific growing medium these plants require, since ordinary potting soil kills a carnivorous plant within weeks. That medium requirement is what opened the door to Zone 2. Zone 2. Sundew leaf pullings. Income range $400 to $600 per month. Startup under $50. Time commitment roughly 2 hours a week. Sundews, a different genus of carnivorous plant covered in sticky, dew-like droplets that trap small insects, propagate through an entirely different and genuinely remarkable method. A single healthy leaf, pulled gently from the parent plant and laid flat on moist growing medium, will regenerate an entirely new, genetically identical plantlet within a matter of weeks. One mature sundew can produce a dozen or more leaf pullings in a single session without meaningfully harming the parent plant at all. Ellie describes discovering this technique as one of the more satisfying moments of her first year, partly because it directly echoed something familiar from her lab background. A form of vegetative propagation not unlike certain tissue regeneration techniques she'd studied in an academic context, except achievable on an ordinary greenhouse shelf with nothing more specialized than a pair of clean tweezers and patience. Watching a single detached leaf, no larger than a fingernail, gradually sprout roots and a tiny new rosette over the course of several weeks never entirely stopped feeling, in her words, a little bit like magic, even after doing it hundreds of times. The secondary income angle here is volume. Because a single leaf produces a full new plant, and a mature sundew has dozens of leaves, this zone has by far the highest output-to-input ratio of anything on the shelf. Ellie sells sundew starts almost entirely through the same online collector marketplace as her flytraps, at $8 to $15 each depending on species, to a buyer base that overlaps heavily with flytrap buyers but skews toward people building out a more serious, varied collection rather than a first-time purchase. Monthly gross on sundew pullings runs $400 to $600, smaller in total dollars than the flytrap zone but considerably higher margin per hour of labor invested, since the leaf pulling process itself takes only minutes per plant. Biggest mistake: pulling leaves from a stressed or unhealthy parent plant. A leaf taken from a plant that isn't actively thriving has a meaningfully lower success rate at regenerating into a viable new plantlet, which wastes both the leaf and the growing space allocated to it. The fix is maintaining a small, deliberately separate group of stock plants kept in ideal conditions specifically for propagation, never pulling leaves from plants sold as finished specimens. Zone 3. Pitcher plants. Income range $500 to $700 per month. Startup roughly $100. Time commitment roughly 3 hours a week. Sarracenia, the North American pitcher plant genus, is the most visually dramatic of the species Ellie grows, with tall, tubular leaves that trap insects through a slippery, downward-facing interior. Unlike flytraps and sundews, pitcher plants propagate primarily through rhizome division, splitting the underground root structure of an established clump, which requires the plant to reach a larger, more mature size before division becomes viable at all. The market here skews toward a more established collector than either of the first two zones. Someone already familiar with basic carnivorous plant care looking to add a genuinely striking specimen to an existing collection. Pitcher plant divisions sell for $20 to $35 each, meaningfully higher than flytraps or sundews, which offsets the considerably longer time a rhizome takes to reach dividable size, often a full growing season or more. Monthly gross on pitcher plants runs $500 to $700. Ellie sells almost exclusively through the collector forum marketplace here, since the specialty shop she works with prefers smaller, faster turnover stock rather than the larger pitcher plant specimens that take up more shelf space per unit sold. Biggest mistake: dividing a rhizome before it's genuinely large enough to support two independent plants. An undersized division frequently fails to establish at all, and because pitcher plants take so much longer to reach dividable size than flytraps or sundews, a failed division represents a considerably larger sunk cost in time. The fix is resisting the temptation to divide early just because a rhizome looks technically splittable, waiting instead until it's grown well past the minimum viable size. Zone 4. Tissue-cultured rare hybrid liners. Income range $400 to $600 per month. Startup roughly $150 to $250 per batch. Time commitment roughly 2 hours a week. This is the zone that surprises people most when they hear the actual math, and it works differently from the first three. Rather than propagating from her own stock plants, Ellie purchases small, unrooted tissue-cultured liners of rare and unusual carnivorous plant hybrids, produced by specialized commercial tissue culture labs, in bulk at a modest per-unit wholesale cost. She grows these out in her greenhouse to a larger, established, sellable size, a process that takes 2 to 4 months depending on species, then sells the finished plants at a considerable markup over what she paid for the tiny starting liner. Here is the income angle almost nobody outside serious plant collector circles understands. A tissue-cultured liner, purchased wholesale, might cost $3 to $6, while the same plant, grown out to an established, thriving size over a few months, sells for $35 to $60 to a collector specifically seeking a rare hybrid that isn't easily propagated through division or leaf pullings at all. The margin exists because growing out a delicate liner to a sellable size requires real skill and consistent greenhouse conditions that most casual buyers, and even many commercial growers focused on volume over specialty rarities, aren't set up to provide. Ellie's background gave her a specific, unusual advantage in this zone that's worth explaining, since it's not something every grower attempting this could replicate immediately. Tissue-cultured plant material arrives essentially sterile, having been grown in a controlled laboratory environment free of the bacteria, fungi, and pests present in any ordinary greenhouse. The transition from that sterile environment to open air is where a plant is most vulnerable to contamination and shock, and Ellie's years of lab experience handling sterile plant cultures for pathology research gave her an intuitive understanding of contamination risk that most hobbyist growers only learn through repeated, costly failure. That's not a claim that this zone is impossible for someone without a lab background. Plenty of serious hobbyist growers succeed at exactly this. But it does explain why Ellie's success rate with liners ran meaningfully higher than what she initially expected based on forum accounts from other growers. Monthly gross on this zone runs $400 to $600, the smallest total dollar figure on the shelf but arguably the most defensible, since Ellie's plant pathology background gives her a genuine edge in keeping delicate liners alive through the vulnerable early growth stage that causes many casual growers to lose a meaningful percentage of any liner batch they attempt. Biggest mistake: transplanting a liner out of its sterile tissue culture container too abruptly, without a proper acclimation period. A liner moved directly from a sealed, humid culture vessel into open greenhouse air often collapses from transplant shock within days. The fix is a gradual, multi-week acclimation process, slowly increasing air exposure before final transplant, which costs nothing but the patience to not rush a step that feels, on the surface, like it should be simple. Zone 5. Starter terrarium kits. Income range $300 to $500 per month. Startup near $0 marginal, layered on top of the first 4 zones. Time commitment roughly 2 hours a week. The final zone exists specifically to capture buyers who want to start a carnivorous plant collection but feel intimidated by the specific care requirements involved. Ellie bundles a small flytrap or sundew, a container, the correct growing medium, and a simple printed care guide into a single ready-to-go starter kit, sold primarily through the specialty houseplant shop rather than the collector forum, since this product targets a genuinely different, more casual buyer than her other 4 zones. The psychology here mirrors a pattern that shows up across a lot of the operations profiled on this channel. An empty pot and a bag of soil ask the buyer to make decisions they're not equipped to make correctly on their first attempt. A complete kit removes every one of those decisions and dramatically increases the odds the buyer's first carnivorous plant actually survives, which matters enormously in a category where a beginner's early, uninformed mistakes are the single biggest reason casual buyers give up on the hobby entirely after one failed attempt. Ellie learned this lesson from her own early customer feedback rather than anticipating it in advance. Her first few sales, before she developed the kit format, were single plants sold without any accompanying guidance beyond a verbal explanation at time of purchase. She noticed a meaningful pattern in the follow-up messages she received over the following weeks. Buyers who'd bought a bare plant asked considerably more troubleshooting questions and reported considerably more plant deaths than the handful of buyers she'd given more detailed written instructions to. That informal observation is what led directly to the printed care guide and the standardized kit format, treating customer education as seriously as the plant material itself. Monthly gross on starter kits runs $300 to $500, concentrated somewhat around spring and early summer when interest in the hobby tends to peak, though less sharply seasonal than some of the other product categories covered on this channel. Biggest mistake: including a plant too small or fragile to survive a beginner's inevitable early care mistakes. A kit meant to convert a curious first-time buyer into a repeat customer backfires badly if the plant dies within the first month regardless of what the buyer does, since that failure gets blamed on the hobby itself rather than on ordinary beginner error. The fix is using only well-established, hardier stock specifically for kits, reserving smaller or more delicate specimens for buyers who've already demonstrated they know what they're doing. 5 zones, 160 square foot shelf, and every single one of them exists because a lab technician's professional eye for careful, controlled propagation happened to land on a plant category most casual growers never think to take seriously. Let's add it up the same way we do at the end of every breakdown on this channel. Venus flytrap divisions, $600 to $900. Sundew leaf pullings, $400 to $600. Pitcher plant divisions, $500 to $700. Tissue cultured rare hybrids, $400 to $600. Starter terrarium kits, $300 to $500. Combined sealing across all 5 zones in a genuinely strong month, $3,300, right around the figure in this video's title. Combined floor in a slower month, $2,200. I want to be direct about that gap, because a breakdown that only shows the strong month isn't actually a full breakdown. Total startup cost across all 5 zones, priced the way Ellie actually built it out over roughly a year and a half rather than all at once. Just under $400, most of it going toward the tissue-cultured liner batches in Zone 4, since the first 3 zones grew almost entirely from stock plants she already owned before ever considering this as income. Every zone beyond the first funded itself from the zone before it, never from outside savings. Daily and weekly time across all 5 zones runs Ellie somewhere between 11 and 14 hours a week, concentrated more heavily in spring when repotting, dividing, and the bulk of her tissue-cultured liner transplanting all land in the same few-week window, dropping to 6 or 7 hours a week in the depths of winter when most of her carnivorous plants enter natural dormancy and require minimal active care. It's worth being honest about what this breakdown doesn't show you, the same way we try to be on every video on this channel. These numbers represent a shelf that took Ellie close to a year and a half to refine into something this reliable. Her first attempts at dividing flytraps too early produced a batch of divisions that mostly failed to establish, a mistake covered directly above, and her first tissue-cultured liner order lost nearly a third of the batch to transplant shock before she nailed down a proper acclimation schedule. If you're building something like this yourself, expect the first several months of any single zone to look closer to its floor, or below it before it climbs toward what's shown here. Now, the part that came closest to undoing a meaningful chunk of this. About 10 months in, with all 5 zones established and the tissue-cultured liner zone finally producing consistent margins, an unusually hot stretch of late summer weather pushed greenhouse temperatures well above what several of her more sensitive sundew and pitcher plant species could comfortably tolerate for an extended period. Ellie's greenhouse ventilation, adequate for ordinary conditions, wasn't sized for the multi-day heat event that hit that particular week, and by the time she recognized the extent of the problem, she'd lost roughly a quarter of her sundew stock plants and 2 of her most valuable pitcher plant specimens to heat stress. She remembers the specific afternoon she realized how bad it had gotten. Coming out to do her normal evening check and finding several sundews with their sticky droplets completely dried out, a telltale sign of severe heat and moisture stress that, in her professional experience with plant pathology, she recognized immediately as considerably more serious than ordinary wilting. 2 of her pitcher plants, rhizomes she'd been growing toward dividable size for the better part of a year, showed the same stress pattern, and by the following week it was clear neither would recover. She told me this was the moment she seriously questioned whether her greenhouse setup, built originally as a casual hobby space rather than a serious growing operation, had genuinely outgrown its own infrastructure. Losing stock plants, rather than finished inventory ready for sale, struck at the foundation the rest of each zone depended on, since a lost stock plant doesn't just cost the plant itself, it costs every future division or leaf pulling that plant would have produced across years of otherwise ongoing propagation. What got her through it wasn't a dramatic fix. She salvaged what she could from the affected plants, propagating aggressively from the surviving tissue rather than treating the loss as final, and installed a simple, inexpensive shade cloth and an additional ventilation fan on a thermostat trigger, costing under $100 combined, specifically sized for the worst heat event her regional weather data suggested was plausible rather than just an ordinary summer day. It's been tested by 2 subsequent heat waves since, and neither came close to causing the same level of stress. That heat event is the reason Ellie now treats her greenhouse's environmental controls with the same seriousness she once applied to a research lab's equipment. And it's the piece of infrastructure she wishes she'd built in from the very beginning rather than learning she needed the hard way. Let's talk about the actual trade-off in time, because it matters more than either the $2,200 or the $3,200 headline number. At her old lab technician job, Ellie worked a standard 40-hour week, but with periodic intensive stretches during grant reporting deadlines 3 to 4 times a year that regularly pushed her past 50 hours for a week or 2 at a stretch. Her salary before the layoff was $54,000 a year. Break that down against her real average annual hours, including those reporting crunches, and it comes to a little under $25 an hour. The greenhouse shelf, at an average month of roughly $2,700 in profit against 12 hours a week, works out to about $52 an hour. Same caveats as always. No benefits, no guaranteed floor, and real biological risk, as the heat event demonstrated directly. It also doesn't include the 1.5 years of trial and error that went into refining every zone to the point they're at now. But even with every caveat included, Ellie hasn't experienced a single grant deadline crunch in over a year, and her income now grows as her stock plants mature further, rather than being capped by a university department's funding decisions made somewhere she has no influence over. To give a sense of how gradual this actually was, rather than a straight climb to $3,200, it's worth walking through the trajectory in broad strokes. The first 3 months produced almost nothing beyond a handful of flytrap division sales through casual forum posts, since Ellie was still learning which propagation techniques actually worked reliably before treating any of this as a real income source. Zone 2, the sundew leaf pullings, came next once she recognized the pattern from her flytraps applied to a different species with an even faster turnaround. Zones 3 and 4 took considerably longer, since pitcher plants require a full growing season to reach dividable size, and the first tissue-cultured liner order took real research and a costly early failure before Ellie refined her acclimation process. It wasn't until close to month 14 that all 5 zones were simultaneously established and producing at something close to their current combined range, which is a meaningfully longer runway than the headline number might suggest on its own. A closely related question people ask is whether Ellie's specific plant pathology background was a genuine prerequisite for this to work, or whether an ordinary hobbyist without that training could realistically build something similar. Her honest answer is nuanced. The core propagation techniques across the first 3 zones, division and leaf pullings, are well documented in hobbyist carnivorous plant communities and don't require any specialized training to execute successfully with enough patience and a few early mistakes. Zone 4, the tissue-cultured liners, is where her background gave a real, meaningful edge, since the sterile handling and contamination awareness involved has a steeper learning curve for someone coming from a purely hobbyist background. Her advice for someone without that background isn't to skip tissue culture entirely, but to expect a longer, more expensive learning period for that specific zone while treating the first 3 as the more accessible starting point. There are a few questions people ask constantly once they hear a breakdown like this, and I'd rather answer them directly. The first is about space, since 60 square feet sounds almost too small to produce these numbers. Ellie's honest answer is that carnivorous plants are unusually well suited to a small footprint, specifically because most species stay compact and tolerate close spacing far better than typical houseplants, which is part of why this particular niche works so well on a single shelf rather than requiring a full greenhouse or a dedicated growing room. The second is about permits, since selling live plants from a residential property sounds like it might trigger some kind of regulatory review. Ellie checked before scaling beyond casual forum sales. Her municipality treats small-scale plant propagation and sales the same way it treats a home craft business, provided there's no retail signage or walk-up storefront, both of which this setup avoids entirely since every sale happens through the specialty shop's own retail license or through direct shipping arranged via the collector marketplace. A closely related question, since several of these species have fairly specific humidity and light requirements, is whether this exact setup would translate to a meaningfully different climate. Ellie's honest answer is that the specific species mix would likely need to shift, since some carnivorous plants tolerate a wider range of ambient humidity and temperature than others, but the underlying category and the tiered product structure built around it would translate regardless of region. A grower in a naturally more humid climate might find sundews and pitcher plants require less supplemental misting than Ellie provides in the drier Pacific Northwest summer air, while someone in a considerably hotter climate would need to think even more seriously about the ventilation and shade infrastructure that Ellie only added after her heat event, rather than treating it as optional from the start. The fourth question, and probably the most common one, is whether this exact combination of 5 zones is the only path to something like this, for someone with zero interest in carnivorous plants specifically. Ellie's answer, and mine, is that the plants themselves are almost beside the point. What actually made this work was recognizing an underexploited collector niche, applying real technical care to a category most casual growers get wrong, and building a tiered product ladder that captures buyers at every level of experience rather than serving only one type of customer. Carnivorous plants happen to be the specific category because of Ellie's own plant pathology background and a stock collection she'd already owned for years before ever monetizing it. In a different situation, with a different existing niche of expertise, the specific plants could look completely different. A fifth question worth addressing directly, since it comes up almost as often as the others: what did Ellie's household actually risk financially to get here, given the tight severance timeline she was working against? Her honest answer is that the total exposure stayed remarkably small throughout, since the first 3 zones grew entirely from stock plants she already owned before the layoff, meaning her only real financial risk was the roughly $400 spent on tissue-cultured liners in Zone 4, spread across several small batches over many months rather than one large upfront order. There was no point at which a failed batch or a bad season could have seriously threatened the household's core finances, since nothing beyond that modest, gradually spent amount was ever on the line at once. None of that makes for a particularly thrilling story to tell out loud. It's not a hidden trick or a secret loophole. It's a single overgrown flytrap divided almost by accident, a year and a half of refining 5 separate propagation methods, a heat wave that came within a hair of wiping out a quarter of her stock plants, and a 60-square-foot shelf that nobody stepping into that greenhouse for the first time would ever guess is generating real income at all. Stepping back from the individual zones for a moment, what stands out most about Ellie's version of this is how directly her prior professional training shaped what she built, even though nothing about her actual job title had anything to do with selling plants. The careful, controlled observation habits from years spent in a research lab, watching for early signs of stress or contamination, tracking outcomes methodically rather than by rough impression, turned out to translate almost perfectly into a category of plant that punishes casual, inattentive care and rewards exactly the kind of patient, precise attention her old job had trained into her for years. That's a pattern worth noticing beyond this specific greenhouse. The skills that made someone valuable in a career that no longer exists for them don't disappear along with the job. They're often the exact edge that makes an unrelated-looking backyard system work considerably better than it would for someone starting from scratch. So, 60 square feet, 1 shelving unit inside a greenhouse Ellie already had. No employees, not one. 11 to 14 hours a week on average, with real seasonal swings. A combined startup cost, spread across a year and a half, of under $400. And an honestly reported floor of roughly $2,200 a month, with a real ceiling of $3,200 in a genuinely strong one. If you'd want to see the actual shelf layout, the specific growing medium recipe, and exactly how the tissue-cultured liner acclimation process works, that's a video this channel is considering putting together as a dedicated build walkthrough separate from this breakdown. Say so in the comments if that's something you'd want to see, and be specific about which of the 5 zones you'd want the closest look at, since that tells this channel far more than a general request for more ever could. If this is the kind of full breakdown you want more of, the real income ranges, the real startup costs, and the real mistakes shown side by side rather than just the highlight numbers, subscribing is the best way to make sure the next one actually reaches you, since this channel publishes a new connected system every single week, and, as this whole breakdown has shown, missing one video means missing the specific mechanism that made the numbers real. Thanks for staying with this one all the way through, from a single overgrown flytrap divided almost by accident at the very start, to the 5th and final zone closing out this shelf right here. 5 zones, 60 square feet, and a combined ceiling of $3,200 a month that nobody stepping into that ordinary backyard greenhouse would ever guess is there.